Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Highland Mystery. Oliver here. Tonight we are bound for Lochdub, where the harbour is small, the hills stand close, and a stranger can set half the village thinking before she has taken off her gloves. One bright woman comes to the water with charm, questions, and a smile that seems to promise harmless fun. Before long, that promise will begin to look doubtful. This is the sort of Highland trouble that does not announce itself with a bang. It starts in the old way. A new face. A glance held a moment too long. A question asked as if it means nothing at all. Men laugh. Women notice. The village begins to sort the stranger into a story before it knows which story will fit. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Hamish Macbeth finds himself doing what he does best. Pretending not to notice, while noticing everything. There is mist on the loch tonight, and the harbour folk are already talking more than they ought. A boat rope, a casual knot, a pretty outsider with an interest in local business, and one of those evenings when Lochdub feels as if it is listening to itself. Hamish would have preferred a quiet supper, his dog at the hearth, his wildcat at the window, and no interruption more serious than village gossip. He is not to be so lucky. So, before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you like what I'm doing here. Tell us where you are and what time it is in the comments. Now, turn off the lights and let's get started tonight. Chapter 1. Fog, Flirtation, and Fresh Trouble. By late afternoon, the rain had held off, but only just. The sky above Lochdub was a pale, strained grey, and the hills beyond the loch were beginning to lose their sharp edges in a drift of mist. In the police station, Hamish Macbeth sat with a file open before him and no real wish to read it. Lugs lay on the floor beside the desk, sprawled like an old hearth rug, one blue eye half open in case any useful food should appear. The office smelled faintly of damp paper, boot polish, and dog. It was, to Hamish's mind, a perfectly decent smell. He leaned back, long legs stretched out, and listened to the village through the open window. A van rattled somewhere near Patel's. A gull cried from the harbour, farther off. A hammer tapped against wood. Lochdub was going about its business, which was the way he liked it. Then Mr. Patel's voice rose from the lane outside. "Constable! Constable Macbeth!" Hamish got up with reluctance. "Come in," he called. Mr. Patel appeared in the doorway, neat as ever, carrying a brown paper bag and an expression of cheerful importance. "I brought you a hot bridie," he said. "Mrs. Patel said you would forget your tea again." "That was kind," said Hamish. "It is also useful. You will need strength. There is a lady at the harbour asking questions." Hamish took the bag. The smell of warm pastry and peppered meat rose at once. Lugs came instantly to life and sat up, ears twitching. "A lady?" Hamish asked. Mr. Patel nodded. "A smart one. City clothes. Sunglasses on her head, though there is no sun. Nessie Curry says she came to see the sea air. Jessie says nobody comes to Lochdub for sea air in shoes like that." Hamish gave a faint grin. "And what do you say?" "I say," said Mr. Patel, "that she has already asked who owns which boats, who goes out at night, and whether the harbour lights are always working." "That is too much interest for a holiday-maker." "That was quick." "In Lochdub," said Mr. Patel with dignity. "News has always travelled faster than official transport." When he had gone, Hamish broke off a corner of the bridie and gave it to Lugs, who swallowed it without gratitude or ceremony. Then Hamish put on his cap and went down towards the harbour, taking his time in the lazy way that made strangers think him half asleep and old villagers know he was not. The air by the water was colder. Mist moved low over the loch and over the harbour mouth in long, pale bands. The small boats rocked at their moorings. Nets hung to dry beside the sheds. The quay held the usual handful of men, with weathered faces and patient eyes, though their patience had begun to wear thin under curiosity. Archie McLean stood beside a stack of creels, his gnarled brown hands busy with a length of twine. Near him was Ian Sutherland, broad-shouldered and dark, with the look of a man who could grow sullen at speed. Eyelid Gunn, who managed the harbour co-op, had a ledger tucked under one arm and the brisk manner of someone who preferred disorder to keep its distance. And among them, in a cream raincoat, and a scarf, the colour of sea glass, stood the stranger. She turned at the sound of Hamish's step and smiled at once, as if she had been waiting for exactly the right audience. She was perhaps in her 30s, glossy-haired and quick-eyed, with a sort of face that was less beautiful than expertly arranged. Her smile was warm. Her attention was warmer. Hamish had seen that kind before. It was not affection. It was method. "Constable Macbeth?" she said. "Ah, yeah. I'm Cleo Ma. I've only just arrived, and I'm told you are the person who knows everyone." "In Lochdub," said Hamish mildly. "That would depend who's asking." She laughed as if he had been charming. "I'm only curious. Such a lovely place. One feels there must be stories." "Too many," said Archie dourly. Cleo ignored him. "I was admiring the harbour, and the boats. I do like knowing how places work." Hamish looked past her, over the water. The mist had thickened a little more. One of the harbour lamps would need lighting before long. "Most places work by folk minding their own business," he said. She tilted her head. "And does Lochdub?" "Not especially." That won another laugh. Cleo had a way of placing her hand lightly on a man's sleeve when she spoke to him, as if he had already become an ally. Hamish noticed that she had done it to Archie, to Ain, and now was thinking whether to do it to him. She thought better of it. Perhaps because Luggs had planted himself squarely between them. The dog stood in front of her shoes like a furry protest, and would not budge. "Oh, what a darling!" Cleo said. Luggs stared at her without expression. "He doesna care for being stepped over," said Hamish. "I wouldn't dream of it." From beneath the nearest stack of creels, a pair of wild yellow eyes flashed. Sonsie was half hidden in the shadows, her striped body still, her broad head lowered. She did not like visitors much, and she liked clever ones less. After one long, unsociable stare at Cleo, she vanished again. Cleo glanced after the cat. "Good heavens! Is that really yours?" "More or less. It looked like something out of the hills." "That? As well." Eyelid Gunn closed her ledger. "Miss Ma was asking about moorings," she said, "and whether any of the smaller boats are hired out privately." "Are they?" asked Cleo brightly. "Sometimes," said Eyelid. "Through proper channels." Hamish heard the dryness in her voice. Eyelid kept accounts the way some women kept silver, bright and orderly, and not to be touched with greasy fingers. Cleo, by contrast, seemed the sort to leave fingerprints on everything. Archie clicked his tongue and held up a basket rope he had been working on. "Ye'll no keep a creel from shifting wi' yon loose nonsense," he muttered to a younger man beside him. "Watch." Hamish paused. Archie had taken a short length of orange creel twine and was working it neatly around the end of a rope. The twine had been tarred at the tip, old-fashioned and sticky. Archie made 3 compact turns and drew the stopper knot snug with practised fingers. "There," he said. 3 turns. No 2. Holds proper in the wind. Gives ye warning afore anything slips." Hamish watched for no particular reason, except that Archie always did things properly, and proper habits interested him. The orange twine stood out against the darker rope. Cleo, however, had noticed too. "What is that called?" she asked. "A stopper knot," said Archie. "It's very pretty." Archie looked offended. "It's useful." "Useful things are often pretty." "Not in my experience," said Archie. Even Ian gave a reluctant snort at that. For a moment the group loosened. Cleo used the change at once. "So who goes out latest?" she asked. "I saw a light farther down the loch as I came in. Do fishermen here make night runs?" No one answered at once. Hamish looked at her. She asked lightly, but not idly. Her gaze had sharpened a fraction. It moved from face to face and did not miss much. Ian bent to pick up a coil of rope, Eyelid's mouth set in a straight line. "Runs for what?" Hamish asked. Cleo gave him an innocent look. "Fish, I suppose. What else?" "There are easier ways to learn about fish," said Eyelid. "Oh, I never like the easier way." "That," said a shrill voice from behind them, "is the trouble with modern women." Nessie Curry and Jessie Curry had arrived without anyone seeing them approach, both in their camel hair coats, both wearing thick spectacles, both carrying the air of people attending a scandal before its official opening. "Too much lipstick," said Nessie. "Too much lipstick," echoed Jessie, and asking questions on the pier as if she were from the newspapers. "From the newspapers." Cleo turned with admirable grace. "How delightful," she said. "You must be sisters." "We are observant," said Nessie. "Very observant," said Jessie. Hamish kept his face straight. "The Curry sisters were wrong about half of what they said and useful about the other half." Mrs. Wellington was coming down the lane as well, hat pinned firmly against the breeze. Hamish had the clear sense that by supper-time, Lochdub would know Cleo Marr's name, coat colour, shoe size, and preferred tone of voice. It would probably invent the rest. Cleo seemed to understand that she had become the centre of a small theatre and liked it. She folded her arms and smiled at Hamish again. "Tell me," she said. "Do the harbour lights ever fail?" "Not often," said Hamish. "But they have done?" "Aye. And when they do, what happens?" Hamish took a bite of the bridie at last, more to delay than from hunger. It was hot, peppery, and much better than anything the Strathbane canteen could have produced on its best day. Lugs gazed up at it with spiritual longing. "What happens?" said Hamish. "Is folk complain?" She laughed. But he did not think she had got what she wanted. Not yet. The mist thickened another step. A bell clinked softly against a mast. Somewhere farther out on the water, a motor coughed, then fell quiet. The evening had not grown dark, but it had begun to narrow. Sounds carried oddly. Faces seemed closer and less readable. Cleo drew her scarf tighter and looked out across the harbour, not with the simple pleasure of a visitor, but with the intentness of someone taking measure. Hamish finished the last of the bridie and gave Lugs the final scrap. He had the uneasy feeling that Cleo Marr had not come to Lochdub for scenery, sea air, or any other tale fit for strangers. She had come because there was something here she meant to find, or something she meant to use. And as he watched her standing by the moorings, smiling into the mist as if it had told her a secret, Hamish thought the harbour had taken on the look it wore before weather turned. Chapter 2. Priscilla comes ashore. By the time Hamish left the harbour, the evening had grown thin and damp. The mist had come farther inland, and the road above the loch looked as if it had been rubbed over with a dirty thumb. Lights were beginning to show in cottage windows. A curl of peat smoke drifted low across the lane. Lochdub was drawing in upon itself for the night. Lugs trotted at Hamish's heel, in a more hopeful mood than before, for he had judged from long experience that dusk improved the chances of supper. Hamish had just reached the bend by the manse when he heard the sound of a motor car approaching from the direction of Strathbane. Cars came into Lochdub often enough, but not with that smooth, expensive hum. Most village traffic rattled, coughed, or announced a loose bit of metal somewhere underneath. This one sounded as if it had never known mud. Hamish stopped. The little dark car glided round the bend and slowed. Then it stopped altogether, and Priscilla Halberton Smythe stepped out with the calm assurance of a woman who had never in her life doubted a road would lead where she intended. She wore a pale raincoat belted close at the waist, and her fair hair, tucked beneath a silk scarf, still contrived to look expensive. Her face was cool, oval, and controlled, but her eyes rested on Hamish with the faint amusement that had always been able to unsettle him more than warmth would have done. "Hello, Hamish," she said. "Hullo, Priscilla." Lugs bounded forward at once, delighted by beauty, breeding, and the chance of attention. Priscilla bent and stroked his head. "You look exactly the same," she said. "That'll be because I've not made much effort to improve. That has never stopped you before." Hamish took off his cap and put it on again. "What brings ye here?" "Oh, nothing dramatic. I was passing through." Hamish looked at her. Priscilla never passed through anywhere without a reason. She raised one fair eyebrow, knowing he knew it. "I had a few days free," she said. "I thought I might see my father and then perhaps drive on." "Must one apply to the local constable for permission?" "Only if one means trouble." "That sounds promising." Behind them came the whisper of shoes on the wet road. Nessie and Jessie Curry had materialized from the soft evening, as if released by gossip itself. "Priscilla Halberton Smythe," cried Nessie. "Priscilla Halberton Smythe," echoed Jessie. "Home again." "Again." "And just when there is another woman in the village." "In the village." Priscilla turned with perfect composure. "Good evening." Nessie gave a small, sharp smile. "We were saying to ourselves that Lochdub was unusually lively." "Very lively," said Jessie. Hamish felt the back of his neck grow warm. He knew exactly what line of village thought was forming, and disliked it not because it was wrong, but because it was so swift. Priscilla glanced from the Curry sisters to Hamish and back again. "I see I have arrived in time for a bulletin." "In Lochdub," said Hamish. "Ye're always in time for that." "Then perhaps," said Priscilla, "you had better buy me a drink before I am discussed into a full engagement." The Curry sisters made a pleased sound, like hens who had found a fresh patch of earth. At the pub the windows glowed against the fogged dark. Inside, the room was warm with the smell of ale, damp wool, frying haddock, and old wood polished by years of elbows. Hamish preferred simple places where a man could sit by the fire and be left alone, but he knew very well that on a wet Highland evening no one in Lochdub was ever really left alone. Mrs. Wellington sat near the fire with a glass of sherry and an expression of mild disapproval at the weather. Archie McLean was at a table with a bowl of stew and more beard stubble than dignity. Ian Sutherland stood at the far end of the room with two other fishermen, speaking in low voices. At the bar, not behind it but leaning there as if she had every right to the place, stood Elspeth Grant. She had come down from Glasgow so often on one pretext or another that the village took her for one of its own whenever it suited. She turned as Hamish entered, and her silver-grey eyes sharpened at once when she saw Priscilla beside him. "Well, well," she said softly. "The weather really is changing." Priscilla smiled with polished civility. Elspeth, Priscilla, the two women were perfectly pleasant, which in their case meant more than enough had already been said. Hamish took refuge in practicalities and ordered soup, bread, and a pie that looked honest. Priscilla asked for white wine, which made the room notice her all over again. Elspeth took her whisky and soda to a nearby table without asking to join them. That, Hamish knew, was far more dangerous than if she had done. Lugs settled under Hamish's chair, then rolled onto one side, belly out, as if he had been laid there by a bored housemaid. He accepted a crust with the gravity of a pensioner receiving a state benefit. "So," said Priscilla, once the food had come, "who is the woman?" Hamish looked up. "What woman?" "The woman everyone is pretending not to mention." Hamish tore bread and dipped it in soup. "A visitor. That much I gathered from the curry chorus. Attractive, I believe." "If ye say so." Priscilla gave him a cool glance. "Hamish, if you try to look innocent, you resemble a schoolboy with jam in his pocket." Before he could answer, the door opened again, and Cleomar came in trailing mist and scent and the slight stir that attends a person who expects to be noticed. She saw Hamish at once. Then she saw Priscilla. Something bright and quick passed over her face. Not quite surprise, and not quite annoyance. She crossed the room with easy confidence. "Constable Macbeth. We keep meeting. A small village," said Hamish. Cleo turned to Priscilla and held out a hand. "Cleomar! Priscilla Halberton Smythe. How lovely. I've heard your name already." "In Lochdub," said Priscilla. "That would not be difficult." Cleo laughed, but the laugh had a thin edge to it. "I was just saying to Mr. McLean that this place is full of stories." "A failing of small communities," said Priscilla. "Oh, I should think a strength. People reveal themselves so quickly." Elspeth, listening from her table, lifted her glass. "Only to a skilled observer." Cleo cast her a quick glance, measuring and filing her away. Then she turned back to Hamish and rested her fingertips lightly on the back of his chair, as if the right to touch other people's furniture came naturally to her. "I was hoping," she said, "that someone might explain an odd thing I heard at the harbour." "A fish-tail, was it?" asked Archie from the fire. "No. More interesting than that. There was a little hush, not enough to be rude, but enough for Hamish to notice. Priscilla noticed it as well. Her eyes lowered briefly to her wineglass, then lifted again. Elspeth did not move at all. Cleo smiled. "I may even have a little recording. Something from the pier. Quite accidental, of course." The room seemed to pull in tighter. Hamish saw Ian Sutherland, at the far end near the snug, go still in the middle of lifting his pint. Not dramatic, Not enough for anyone who did not know the village, but still enough. Eyelid Gun, who had just entered behind Cleo and taken off her coat near the door, bent rather carefully to hang it up. Too carefully. Her face, when she straightened, was tidy as ever. "A recording of what?" asked Elspeth. Cleo gave a careless shrug. "Voices? Men talking when they thought no one was listening? Boats? Money? Night work? Perhaps nothing at all. But one never knows, does one?" Archie scowled. "Ye should no be sneaking about wi' machines." "Oh, everyone records everything now," said Cleo. "It is hardly a crime." "No," said Hamish. "But it can make folk nervous." She looked directly at him. "Are your villagers nervous, Constable?" "Some aye. Some only when they ought to be." Priscilla set down her glass with precise fingers. "Miss Marr, are you collecting local colour or blackmail material?" There was a small, shocked intake of breath from Mrs. Wellington. Cleo smiled again. "How direct. I like that." "I doubt that," said Priscilla. Hamish felt the evening begin to tilt. This was the trouble with certain kinds of people. Separately, they were manageable. Together, they could turn a room into a wire stretched too tight. Blair chose that moment to telephone. The landlord shouted from the passage that the call was for the police. Hamish got up with relief and went to the box near the back, though relief vanished the moment he heard Blair's voice. "Macbeth, what idiotic nonsense is this I'm hearing?" "What particular nonsense?" "Don't you get clever with me." "Some woman from Strathbane says there's a lot of funny business down at your harbour. Missing shellfish. Lights not working. Night runs. Why am I hearing this from a journalist before I hear it from you?" Hamish shut his eyes for a moment. "Because half the Highlands are hearing things before I am." "Well, hear this. If you've got smuggling, corruption, or anything else that might interest the newspapers, I want it contained. Do you understand? I'm not having Lochdub made to look like a circus. It manages that without help." "What?" "Nothing, sir." Blair breathed heavily into the line. Hamish could almost smell the whiskey. "And another thing," Blair said. "Don't go mooning around after village women when there's work to be done. I know your style." Hamish's voice softened. "Do ye, now?" Blair, sensing danger too late, blustered on for another minute and then rang off without achieving anything except to worsen Hamish's temper. When Hamish returned, Cleo was laughing at something Elspeth had said, though Elspeth herself did not look amused. Priscilla was sitting very straight. Outside, rain had begun at last, thin and slanting against the window. The mist pressed at the glass as if trying to hear. Cleo reached for her bag. "Well?" she said brightly. "I mustn't outstay my welcome. Not on my first evening." "I should not worry," said Elspeth. "That generally comes later." Cleo paused. "How charming this village is." "No," said Hamish quietly, watching her. "It only looks that way." She met his gaze for a second too long, then smiled and went out into the wet dark. For a while no one said very much. Then the room breathed again. Priscilla turned her head and looked at Hamish. "You have trouble?" "Ah, yeah. And she means to make more." "Ah, yeah." Priscilla glanced at the rain-blurred window, where Cleo's figure had vanished into fog and lamplight. "Then," she said, "I am glad I arrived when I did." Hamish did not answer at once. He had the uncomfortable feeling that by morning Lochdub would have arranged itself into sides, stories, and suspicions, and that none of them would fit neatly. Near the fire, Lugs gave a deep, contented sigh and went back to sleep. Hamish envied him. Chapter 3. The Slipway Silence. Hamish was woken before dawn by a hard knocking at the police station door, and by Lugs flinging himself upright from his blanket, with a bark that seemed much larger than the hour deserved. For a moment Hamish did not move. It was cold enough to make the room feel mean. The sky beyond the window was no more than a thin grey wash. Somewhere outside, water knocked softly against stone. Then the knocking came again, quick and urgent, and he swung his long legs out of bed with a groan. All right, he muttered. Lugs danced about his feet while Hamish pulled on his trousers and jersey. Sonsie, who had spent the night on the sill, opened one wild yellow eye and then vanished through the cat flap, as if to say that human emergencies were no business of hers. At the door stood Archie McLean, bareheaded in the mist, his face the colour of old rope. "There's a woman doon by the slipway," he said. "In the water." Hamish's sleep left him at once. "Alive?" Archie shook his head. The mist lay thick over the harbour. It had not lifted at all in the night, but had settled in closer, so that the lamps on the quay looked like blurred coins, and the far end of the pier was swallowed whole. The gulls were quiet. Even the usual creak and slap of boats seemed muffled, as if the harbour had put a hand over its own mouth. By the time Hamish reached the slipway, with lugs trotting close and shivering rain needling at his face, there were already half a dozen people gathered in that strained, respectful way villagers had when death appeared among them. Eyelid Gunn stood a little apart, her coat buttoned to the throat. Iene Sutherland was near the mooring posts, cap pulled low. Nessie and Jessie Curry were on the road above, not daring to come nearer and not willing to go away. Dr. Brodie was kneeling at the edge of the shallow water. Hamish knew who it was before he saw the face. The cream raincoat, darkened by loch water, had already told him enough. Cleo Marr lay on one side near the foot of the slipway, half in the water, one arm bent awkwardly beneath her. There was no blood, no ugliness, only the pale stillness of a body from which surprise had not yet quite gone. Her hair had come loose and spread wetly against the stones. Dr. Brodie rose when Hamish came near. "She's dead," he said unnecessarily. "Been in the water some hours, but not long enough for much drift." "I'd say sometime in the night." Hamish crouched beside the doctor and looked without touching. The wet stones were slick with weed. One of Cleo's shoes was missing. Her handbag lay farther up the slope against a post, damp but not washed away. "She fell?" asked Hamish. Dr. Brodie made a slight movement with one shoulder. "Perhaps. But I'd rather not say more until she's seen properly. She's taken in water. There's bruising on one wrist. That may mean something or nothing." Hamish nodded. Lugs, who had come padding down the stones despite a sharp word, stopped short near the body and whined softly. Then he sat down, ears drooping, as if he knew this was no place for foolishness. Above them, Nessie Curry clasped her hands. "I said she'd bring trouble." "Trouble?" echoed Jessie. Mrs. Wellington, who had arrived wrapped in a dark coat and moral certainty, said, "For goodness sake, this is not the moment." "It is always the moment to tell the truth," said Nessie. Hamish stood up and looked round. "I'd be obliged if everybody kept back." Eyelid spoke at once. "I came as soon as Archie hammered on my door. I locked the co-op shed and came straight here," Ian said. "I just come down to check my lines." Nessie, unable to bear being left out, called from the road, "She was seen in the pub." "In the pub?" said Jessie. "We all saw her." "All. Thank you," said Hamish. He said it mildly, but something in his face made them fall quiet. He walked up the slipway and looked out through the mist. A small dinghy moved faintly beyond the nearer moorings, rocking where it should not have been. It was not far out, but far enough to matter. A hired dinghy, by the look of it, and adrift. "That hers?" he asked Eyelid. She peered out. "It may be one of the co-op boats." "Hers," said Archie. "I saw her asking yesterday which ones could be had without fuss." Hamish went to the nearest mooring post. The rope there hung loose and wet. He bent and examined the end. Not snapped, not cleanly cut either. The fibres were fresh and roughened, as if they had been forced and abraded through strain. He ran the rope between finger and thumb. Something about it nagged at him at once. He looked back at the dinghy, then at the slope where Cleo had been found. If she had gone aboard in the dark or thick fog, and the boat had shifted away from the slip at the wrong moment, she might have fallen between stone and hull. She might have panicked. She might have struck her head or lost her footing and gone under. Might. There were too many mights. "Who found her first?" he asked. "Me," said Archie. "I came doon early. Thought at first it were a bundle of sailcloth." Hamish nodded again. Archie was not a fanciful man when facts would do. "Did anybody move anything?" "No." "Did anybody see her leave the pub last night?" A pause met that. Then Elspeth's voice came out of the mist behind him. "I did." He turned. She came down from the road, hair damp with drizzle, coat open over a dark jumper, eyes bright and watchful. "She left alone," Elspeth said, "a little after closing." She looked pleased with herself. Was she drunk? No more than pleased. Did anybody go after her? Elspeth glanced briefly at the others. Not that I saw. That does not mean no one did. Chief Inspector Blair arrived then in an official car that braked too hard on the wet road and sent gravel skittering. He climbed out in a fury of coat, breath, and stale smoke, as if the fog itself had insulted him. "What in hell is this?" he bawled. "Can nobody in this blasted village stay alive till breakfast?" He came stamping down towards the slipway, red-faced and sweating despite the cold. The smell of whiskey clung to him beneath the cigarettes. Luggs raised his lip in quiet dislike and moved closer to Hamish's leg. Blair stopped when he saw the body, and swore under his breath. "That the woman from last night?" "Aye," said Hamish. Blair looked from Cleo to the water and back again. "Drunken accident. Fell in. Case closed." No one answered. The harbour seemed to disapprove in silence. Dr. Brodie said, "I would wait before making pronouncements." Blair glared at him. "I'll make the pronouncements." Elspeth folded her arms. "Then at least make accurate ones." Blair ignored her. "Macbeth, get names, times, statements, and keep these idiots back." He turned and barked at Ian. "You! Did you see her?" Ian's face darkened. "No. Did you quarrel with her?" "No, because I'm hearing she was asking questions." At that, Hamish saw it happen. Blair's first certainty began to alter shape. It was only a fraction, but he knew the signs. Accident was one thing. A dead outsider who had been prying into harbour business was something else, and much more useful to a man who liked noise. "Questions about what?" Blair demanded. No one answered quickly enough for him. Nessie Curry called from the road. "Night runs." "Runs!" said Jessie. "Money. Money." Blair swung round. "What?" Hamish could have cursed them, though he knew they were only doing what Lochdub always did, taking scraps and handing them over already chewed. Elspeth said coolly, "She told half the pub she had a recording of men talking at the harbour." Blair's little eyes sharpened. "A recording? So," she said. He looked down at the body again, now with appetite rather than annoyance. "Well, well." Hamish felt his own temper stir. Blair would turn grief into theatre before the morning was out if left to himself. He crouched once more by Cleo's handbag and opened it carefully. Powder, compact, purse, keys, a lipstick, no telephone, no recorder. "Looking for her machine?" asked Blair. "Ah, yeah. Maybe she never had one." "Maybe." Blair squinted through the mist towards the drifting dinghy. "What's that boat doing out there?" "That," said Hamish, "is what I'd like to know." He stood and faced the harbour again. The loose rope at the mooring post moved slightly in the damp wind. The abraded end caught his eye once more. Not broken, not right, and the dinghy was too far out for mere carelessness, unless someone had been uncommonly unlucky. Hamish had lived long enough in Lochdub to know that luck was often blamed for things people had done deliberately. He straightened. "Sir," he said, "that boat didna get there by magic." Blair sniffed. "Don't start one of your Highland fancies on me." Hamish's voice softened. "No fancy, just rope." Blair scowled, but Hamish was no longer listening to him. He was looking past the slipway, past the blurred lamps and the half-hidden sheds, towards the place where sea business and village business met and covered for one another. Somewhere in that wet, grey hush, someone had expected the mist to hide more than a body, and Hamish, with the morning cold creeping through his clothes and lugs pressed warm against his shin, began to think the harbour had been waiting all along for somebody to ask the right question. Chapter 4. Canteen Gristle, Harbour Chowder. By 11 o'clock, Blair had decided that the matter would be properly handled only if it were handled noisily and from Strathbane. He bundled Hamish into the car with a sheaf of papers, 2 contradictory opinions, and a smell of stale whiskey that might have frightened off a weaker man. Rain struck the windscreen in sharp little darts, and the road out of Lochdub ran between wet hills and black peaty ditches. The loch lay dull and secretive to one side, the mist still refusing to lift. Blair drove as if all corners were personal insults. "We'll get this tidied by lunchtime," he said. "I'm not letting one dead flirt from nowhere turn into a Highland opera." Hamish sat long and folded in the passenger seat, saying very little. That usually encouraged Blair to say too much. "She was drinking," Blair went on. "She was prying. She fell in. Or somebody shoved her. Same difference if I can get a name on it by noon." "It's no usually the same difference in court," said Hamish. Blair gave him a sideways glare. "Don't start." At Strathbane the station was as depressing as ever. The corridors smelled of damp coats, cheap polish, and overboiled vegetables. The canteen was worse. Hamish had long believed that food ought to offer some small apology for being eaten. Strathbane canteen food did not. It arrived on a tray in pale scoops and brown strips, looking as if the cook had lost interest halfway through the process and the management had encouraged this. Blair attacked his plate with the confidence of a man who mistook appetite for discernment. Hamish looked down at his own lunch. There was something that may once have been stew and now appeared committed to another profession. The potatoes had the texture of old paper. The cabbage had surrendered in spirit some hours before. Jimmy Anderson slid into the seat opposite, fox-faced and faintly hungover, with watery blue eyes that brightened at the sight of company. "Grand day for poison," he said, eyeing Hamish's plate. "Is it food?" Hamish asked. "Officially," Blair snorted. "You Highland savages would complain if it was nailed to the table." Hamish prodded the stew. "I'd complain less if it were dead certain what animal it had been." Jimmy smothered a grin. Blair, who regarded humour in others as a kind of theft, leaned forward. "Now then, that woman Ma, we've checked her room." "And?" asked Hamish. And she was exactly what she looked like. Trouble. Fancy clothes, makeup all over the place, bills she couldn't pay, and a notebook full of names as if she thought she was a reporter. Jimmy wiped gravy from his lip with a paper napkin. "Not exactly a reporter." "What then?" Jimmy took a small notebook from his pocket. According to the hotel receipt and the papers in her room, she'd been ringing folk and setting up interviews. Wrote them down neat enough. Here. Blair snatched the page first, then read out in a mocking tone. E.G. Private chat, Harbour office, 7:30. I.S. Later, if he stops sulking. Hamish held out a hand. Blair gave the notebook over grudgingly. The initials sat there plainly enough. E.G. could only be Elid Gun. I.S. was likely Ian Sutherland. Hamish read the line twice. Under it, in smaller writing, Cleo had scribbled, "Knows more than he says." "Anything else?" Hamish asked. Jimmy said, "A hotel maid says Miss Ma asked where she might find the Harbour co-op manager without being seen by the whole village. That was hopeful of her. Then later she asked after Sutherland, said he had a temper, and men with tempers often talked too much." Blair pounced on that like a terrier on a sock. "There you are. Jealous fisherman. Short fuse. Woman dead. We'll have him up and done with." Hamish looked at the notebook again. "It says she wanted to speak to Eyelid first." "So?" "So maybe she thought Eyelid had something worth hearing." Blair stabbed at the stew. "Women like that always start with the respectable one. Makes the dirty one easier after." Jimmy shifted slightly, keeping out of range of both temper and gravy. Hamish let the matter drop for the moment. One learned to save argument with Blair for when it might purchase something useful. Besides, the canteen food had deadened even his taste for contradiction. He rose as soon as he decently could. "Where are you off to?" demanded Blair. "Back to Lochdub. You'll stay till I say." Hamish's face remained mild. "You've the notebook. You've the hotel statements. You've lunch. I've a harbour to look at." Blair reddened. "Don't you take that tone." "What tone?" "That damned innocent one." Jimmy coughed into his hand to hide a smile. In the end, Blair let him go. Not because he had been persuaded, but because another officer came in with a question about a separate mess, and Blair could never resist the chance to bully a fresh audience. Hamish drove back with relief. The further he left Strathbane behind, the better the air seemed, though the weather was turning meaner. A thin drizzle crawled over the road. The hills were the colour of old tweed. By the time he reached Lochdub, he was hungry enough to regret even canteen stew, which was a bad sign in itself. At Patel's general store, he stopped for bread and heard at once that the village had spent the morning hard at work on the case. Mrs. Patel handed him a loaf, still warm, from a delivery van and lowered her voice. "Mrs. Wellington says the woman was a wicked hussy. Nessie Curry says she had a machine that caught sins in the dark. Jessie says fishermen have no morals after sunset. Mr. Patel says they should all mind their own business." "That would empty the village," said Hamish. Mr. Patel emerged from the back with a small enamel container in his hands. "Take this," he said. "What is it?" "Fish chowder from Tommel Castle Kitchens. They sent too much over for luncheon." Mrs. Patel improved it with pepper. "Otherwise, rich people never season anything properly." Hamish accepted it with gratitude bordering on emotion. "You're a blessing." "I am practical," said Mr. Patel. "Also, the dog is looking hopeful." Luggs, who had followed him in and was now sitting beside the counter in a posture of saintly patience, thumped his tail. On the way out, Hamish nearly collided with Nessie and Jessie Curry, both wrapped in camel-hair coats and satisfaction. "She met Eyelid," said Nessie at once. "Met Eyelid," echoed Jessie. "How do you know?" asked Hamish. "We saw her going into the office after supper." "After supper." And she cornered Ian by the creels. He looked black as thunder. Black as thunder. Mrs. Wellington, who had been examining tins she did not intend to buy, added in her clear church voice, "She was not a tactful woman." "That," said Hamish, "is putting it kindly." Back at the police station, he set the chowder to heat on the little stove. The room warmed at once with the smell of fish, parsley, onion, and something decent. Luggs placed himself beside the table, every line of him devoted to hope. Sonsie appeared soundlessly on the sill, then sprang down and sat with her tail curled round her paws, watching the proceedings with fierce yellow eyes. "You two have the timing of pickpockets," Hamish told them. Luggs rested his head on Hamish's knee. Sonsie, contemptuous of begging, waited until Hamish had filled his own bowl and then moved nearer by stages, as if proximity were coincidence. Hamish tore bread, blew on the first spoonful, and felt his mind improve at once. There was a reason why Blair never solved anything over canteen muck. A man needed food with a backbone if he meant to think clearly. So Cleo had arranged a private meeting with Eyelid Gunn. Later, she had cornered Ian Sutherland. She had asked about night runs, harbour lights, and boats. She had claimed to possess a recording. Then she had ended in the water. Hamish fed Luggs a small bit of fish. Luggs swallowed it and looked pained that justice moved so slowly. He flicked a scrap towards Sonsie. She seized it neatly and vanished under the desk to eat in private, as if embarrassed to be seen taking charity. "Eyelid first," Hamish said aloud. "Why Eyelid first?" "Because Eyelid was respectable. Because she kept the books. Because if there was money going astray or boats doing what they should not, Eyelid would know." "And Ian?" Cleo had written, "If he stopped sulking." That sounded less like conspiracy than temper. A man made awkward by her, perhaps, or angered by being toyed with. Hamish ate another spoonful and looked out of the small station window. The harbour lay grey beyond the road. The gossip had begun to harden already into shapes people could live with. A dead outsider. A touchy fisherman. A woman from the co-op. Her village choosing what story it wanted before the facts had bothered to arrive. There came a knock at the door. It was Elspeth, rain on her shoulders, and curiosity bright in her eyes. "Well?" she asked. Hamish lifted the chowder pot slightly. "I've found something useful at last." She smiled despite herself. "Food? And names." That made her come in. Hamish set a second bowl on the table. Luggs brightened. Sonsie reappeared as if summoned by the possibility of new theft. He told Elspeth about the notebook entry, the maid's statement, and what the Curry sisters had seen. She listened without interrupting, save once to ask whether Blair had already chosen a villain. "He's halfway there," said Hamish. "Then you had better get there first." Hamish leaned back, bowl in hand, and looked down at Luggs, who was gazing up with solemn blue eyes, and then at Sonsie, who had placed one large paw over a fish scrap as if claiming disputed territory. Aye, he said quietly. Because somebody spoke to Cleo that night thinking it would keep her quiet. Outside, the drizzle thickened over Lochdub. Inside, the little station held warmth, chowder, and the uncomfortable beginning of a pattern. And Hamish, now properly fed, began to suspect that the wrong person was already being chosen for the right kind of crime. Chapter 5. Blair finds a convenient villain. The rain stopped by afternoon, but only in the grudging Highland way that suggested it might begin again the moment a man left his coat indoors. The harbour shone with wet boards and dark rope. The sheds smelled of salt, diesel, and old fish. Above the loch, the hills stood under a low ceiling of cloud, as if the day had not fully decided whether to brighten or sour. Hamish came down from the station with lugs ambling at his side, and found half the village already arranged in useful places for watching. No one in Lochdub ever admitted to gathering for a scene. They merely happened to be present when one occurred. Archie McLean was mending gear near the pier. Mrs. Wellington had paused on the road with a parcel she had plainly no wish to deliver too quickly. Nessie and Jessie Curry stood by Patel's van, each with the expression of a woman prepared to be shocked in detail. Even Angus the seer had drifted near the harbour wall, staring out through the damp air as though the loch might make a confession to him personally. The source of interest was Blair. He had arrived in another official temper and now strode along the quay with a notebook in one hand and a cigarette in the other, despite the wind trying to put it out for the public good. His face had taken on that swollen pinkness which always suggested either indignation or poor digestion, and often both. Ian Sutherland stood beside a stack of crates, broad and stiff, and plainly wishing himself somewhere else. His teenage son, Davy, hovered a little behind him, with the raw, defensive look of a boy old enough to be angry and young enough to show it badly. Blair stopped in front of them, as if beginning a stage performance. "Well then," he boomed, "perhaps you'll tell me where you were after closing last night." Ian's mouth flattened. "At home? With witnesses?" "My wife." Blair gave a nasty little smile. "Convenient." Hamish came down the slipway without hurry. "Afternoon, sir." Blair glanced round. "About time. I was speaking to Mr. Patel." "About what?" "Mostly bread." A few heads turned away quickly, hiding smiles. Blair reddened. "This is serious, Macbeth." "So it is." Blair jabbed his cigarette towards Ian. "This man quarrelled with the dead woman. Half the village says so." "Half the village says a great many things," said Hamish. Ian gave him one quick look of gratitude, then lowered his eyes again. Davy shifted his boots on the wet boards. Blair noticed the boy at once. "And who's this? Son, is it? Perhaps he heard something useful. Or did the whole family go out together for a midnight swim?" Davy took a step forward, but Ian put out an arm and held him back. "That's enough," said Ian. "No," said Blair. "It's enough when I say it is. If you've taught the lad your temper, perhaps he can tell me how you behaved after a few drinks." Hamish's voice changed very slightly. "There's no need to drag the boy in for sport." The words were mild enough, but the sibilance sharpened. Archie, hearing it, bent lower over his work. He knew that tone. Blair turned. "Sport? Are you? You insolent. We can ask questions without frightening him." "I'll decide how questions are asked." "And I," said Hamish softly, "am telling ye it's poor practice." For a moment the harbour seemed to hold itself still. Even Nessie Curry stopped whispering. Then Blair laughed, though there was nothing of humour in it. "Very touching. The village copper protects his own. Sometimes they need it." Blair took a furious pull on the cigarette and flung it into the wet. "Fine. Then you do it. Ask your clever little questions." Hamish turned to Ian. "Did you speak to Miss Marr last night?" Ian's jaw moved once before he answered. "Aye." "Where?" "By the creels." "About what?" "She was fishing for talk." "Asked who went out late. Asked whether I'd ever seen the harbour lights fail convenient-like. Asked if Eyelid kept 2 sets of books." A stir ran through the listeners. Eyelid Gunn, coming down from the co-op shed with a ledger under one arm, stopped without quite meaning to. "And what did you say?" Hamish asked. "That she should mind her own business." "Did you touch her?" "No." "Did she threaten you?" Ian hesitated. Davy burst out. "She said she could make trouble for us all." Ian swore under his breath. "Davy!" But Hamish had already turned his attention gently towards the boy. "What sort of trouble?" Davy swallowed. "She said she knew folk did runs at night. She said she had proof somebody'd pay to keep quiet." Blair made a triumphant noise. "There! Blackmail and temper. What more do you want?" "Facts," said Hamish. He crouched down suddenly and looked at Davy's boots, then at Ian's. Both were wet with harbour muck, but ordinary harbour muck. Fish scales clung to one sole. There was a thread of weed on the older man's cuff. Nothing unusual there. What mattered was something else. "Ye use green twine on your gear," Hamish said to Ian. Ian blinked. "Aye? So?" "I noticed it yesterday." "So would anybody with eyes." Blair stared between them. "What in God's name does twine matter?" Ian gave a grudging shrug. "Orange tangles more. Green's better. Always has been." Archie, from his place by the nets, muttered, "That depends who tied it." Blair rounded on him. "Did I ask you?" "No," said Archie. "That's why the answer was free." Another tiny rustle of amusement moved among the onlookers. Blair's face darkened further. Hamish straightened and looked at Ian's hands. They were broad, rough, reddened by work. One knuckle was split, the nails were grimy, but there was no tacky black residue at the fingertips. Nothing of tar worked into the skin. On the cuffs of his jacket were fish scales and damp, but not a trace of orange fibre. "Show me your rope there," Hamish said. Ian handed over a coil with visible annoyance. The end had been tied off in a neat, compact knot. "2 turns," said Hamish. "Aye," said Ian. "That's enough for me." He looked faintly proud, as if economy in knot-making were a moral virtue. Blair threw up his hands. "This is absurd. A woman's dead, and you're discussing haberdashery." "Rope," said Hamish. "What?" "Not haberdashery. Rope." Lugs, bored by human incompetence, had lain down near a bollard and now resembled an elderly rug abandoned beside the sea. He opened one eye at Blair's shout and closed it again. From beneath the harbour shed, Sonsie appeared briefly, fierce yellow eyes fixed on the commotion, then melted back into shadow, as if preferring crimes to policemen. Eyelid came nearer at last. "If this is to become a public circus," she said crisply, "you might at least keep clear of the loading path." Blair swung round. "And who asked you?" Hamish answered before she could. "No one." "She's only being sensible." Eyelid's expression did not soften, but he saw strain in the set of her mouth. She liked things orderly. This public shaming of Ian, with half Lochdub feeding on it, would offend her even without the murder. Mrs. Wellington drew herself up beside the road. "Really, Chief Inspector, there is a family present." Nessie Curry immediately said, "Aye, and everybody knows families suffer most when men lose their tempers." "Lose their tempers," echoed Jessie. That was enough. Davy flushed hotly. Ian stepped forward, not at Blair but towards the sisters, and Hamish moved at once between them. "That'll do," he said. His lilt had thickened. The words came very soft and very clear. Nobody moved for a second. Then Blair seized his chance. "There," he said loudly. "Look at him. Bad temper. Exactly what I said. Macbeth, I want him brought in for formal questioning." Hamish kept his eyes on Ian. "Aye, he can come in." Blair blinked, surprised at success. "But not because you've shouted at his son in public and called that police work." Blair opened his mouth. Hamish went on, quiet as falling rain. "And not because it suits ye to have a villain before supper." That landed. Too direct for comfort, too true for denial. Blair recovered by blustering. "You'll regret that tone." "Perhaps." He turned back to Ian. "Come up to the station in half an hour. We'll speak proper there." Ian nodded once. As Hamish walked away, with lugs rising slowly to follow, he heard the harbour begin to breathe again behind him. Gossip would take this fresh scene and knead it into a dozen versions before tea. But one fact had come clear in the middle of all the noise. Ian Sutherland might be jealous, ill-tempered, and unlucky enough to suit Blair's needs. But the wrong twine was the wrong twine. And Hamish had begun to suspect that someone much tidier than Ian had arranged the harbour to tell a simpler story than the truth. Chapter 6. A quiet favour that turns loud. The next morning began with a white, stubborn mist that sat over Lochdub as if it had taken a lease on the village. The harbour bells gave out dull little knocks. Water dripped from gutters. The hills were gone entirely. Hamish looked out from the police station window and thought it was a day made for mistakes. Lugs, sprawled by the stove like an old hearthrug, seemed to agree. He had placed himself where the heat would do him the most good and human duty the least. Sonsie, who had come in wet through the cat flap and objected to it in silence, sat under Hamish's desk, with her fierce yellow eyes half closed and her striped tail wrapped tight round her paws. Hamish had scarcely got through his first cup of tea when Priscilla arrived. She came in without fuss, dressed for the weather in a dark coat and boots fit for wet roads, though she still managed to look as if mud would apologise to her if it splashed too near. She closed the door behind her and stood for a moment with one hand on the latch. "I need to tell you something," she said. Hamish set down his mug. "That sounds ominous." "It may be." Her face was calm, but he knew her well enough to see the strain behind it. Priscilla disliked mess of any kind, social or otherwise. Lochdub supplied both in generous quantities. "What is it?" he asked. "I was on the pier last night." Hamish stared at her. "When?" "Late. After the pub." He straightened slowly in his chair. "What in heaven's name were ye doing there?" "Walking," she said with faint irritation. "I was not creeping about with a lantern and false whiskers, Hamish." He ran a hand through his red hair. "Go on." Priscilla came nearer and lowered her voice, though there was no one there to hear but the dog and the cat, and both had shown themselves discreet in the matter of murder. "I could not sleep. The air in the hotel felt close, so I put on my coat and went down towards the water. The mist was thick. I could hardly see the posts at the end of the slipway, and I heard a woman laugh." "Cleo?" "I assume so." It sounded like her, light and rather pleased with itself. Hamish said nothing. He knew that laugh already. "Then I heard voices," Priscilla went on. "Not clearly. A man and a woman, I think." The woman sounded amused. The man did not. "Could ye make out words?" "A few. Not enough to swear to in court." "Something sharp," she said. "By morning it won't matter what you prefer." Or something very like it. Then the man said something I could not catch, and she laughed again. After that there was a sort of scrape. Rope, perhaps? Wood against stone. I waited, but I saw no one. The mist was too thick. "Why did you not come to me at once?" Her gaze held his. "Because by then half the village had already decided I had come to Lochdub on your account, and I did not much fancy being hauled through Chief Inspector Blair's temper to improve matters." Hamish swore under his breath. It was not a bad reason. Blair would indeed enjoy dragging Priscilla into the case, and the village would enjoy it even more. "Did anybody see ye on the pier?" "I have no idea." "In Lochdub that probably means yes." Hamish got up and went to the window. The mist pressed pale against the glass. Down the road he could just make out Mrs. Wellington speaking to Mrs. Patel beneath an umbrella. Between them, news was probably already travelling at a rate that ought to have interested the post office. "This should be in the statements," he said. "Yes," said Priscilla. "I know." But she did not sound as if she liked it. He turned back. "Blair will roar. He roars on principle." "Aye, and if he can humiliate me publicly, he will call it procedure." That, too, was true. Hamish stood with his hands in his pockets, looking at her. This was the sort of moment in which his better judgment often arrived second. Priscilla had always been able to stir up in him the old divided foolishness. Affection, irritation, hope, and a most unsuitable wish to protect her from the ordinary rough handling of the world. "All right," he said at last. "Let me think a wee bit." Priscilla's brows lifted. "Hamish," "I said let me think. Not hide a corpse. That is not a comforting comparison." He gave a faint grin despite himself. "Stay out of sight for an hour or two. I'll see how to put it." Her mouth tightened, but she nodded. "Very well, though you are being an idiot." "That is seldom news." When she had gone, Lugs opened one eye and thumped his tail once, as if in gloomy approval of private female visits. Sonsie came out from under the desk and sprang to the sill, where she stared into the fog as though expecting scandal to condense in visible form. Hamish made another cup of tea, then gave up on wisdom and went instead to Patel's for something solid. He returned with a bacon roll, still hot, and stood eating it over a file while Lugs sat in devout expectation at his knee. It was decent bacon, properly salty, and the bread had not been ruined by any official attempt at nutrition. Thinking was easier with food worth the effort. He told himself he was only delaying until he could speak to Priscilla more carefully, take the words in order, and spare Blair the chance to trample all over them. Lochdub, however, did not believe in delays. It believed in circulation. By 11:30, Hamish knew he had left it too long. He stepped into Patel's again for envelopes, and found the queue alive with that charged, false casualness which meant news had broken somewhere without him. Nessie Curry stood near the counter in full voice. Jessie stood at her shoulder, repeating the important parts as if underlining them for the hard of hearing. I said all along there was something between them. Between them? Priscilla, Halbert and Smythe, down on the pier in the mist. In the mist? Mrs. Wellington drew in breath. I am sure there is some explanation. There is always an explanation, said Nessie. Sometimes several. Mr. Patel caught Hamish's eye and looked apologetic. Mrs. Patel looked interested. What explanation? Hamish asked. Nessie turned on him with relish. That depends whether one asks the village or the newspapers. Try the truth. It's novel, Jessie said. Elspeth heard it first. Hear what first? Asked Hamish, though he already knew he would not like the answer. At the far end of the queue, Elspeth stood very straight, a paper parcel in her hands. Her face was composed, but not warmly. I heard, she said, that Priscilla was out late, and that you knew it before anyone else. There was no softness in it. Not anger, exactly. Something flatter and more dangerous. Hamish felt the bacon roll turn to ballast in his stomach. It was nothing of that sort, he said. No? Elspeth's voice was quiet. Then perhaps you'd like to explain why everyone else knows you were talking privately with her at the station, while Chief Inspector Blair does not. No one in the shop moved. Hamish said, This is the place. It never is, said Elspeth. She picked up her parcel and went out. Nessie Curry leaned towards Jessie in satisfaction. The forgotten one. The forgotten one, echoed Jessie. Mrs. Patel said sharply. That will do, but the damage had been done. Hamish could feel it racing away from the shop like sparks caught in a dry hedge. By lunchtime the village would have Priscilla as a scandal magnet, Elspeth as the woman left standing, and Hamish as a fool with divided loyalties. None of it would help the case. Blair learned of it within the hour. He came storming into the station, pink and sweating and furious, followed by Jimmy Anderson, who had the decency to look embarrassed by association. You obstructive Highland idiot, Blair bellowed. You had a witness and kept it from me. Hamish stood up slowly. Lugs rose too, not growling but watching. Sonsie vanished from the sill. I was taking the statement properly. You were protecting your lady friend. Hamish's face cooled. Mind your tongue. Blair jabbed a finger at him. Don't you dare! I'll have you transferred to the back end of nowhere for less than this. Hamish almost smiled. Where would that be exactly? Jimmy made a sound that might have been a cough. Blair swung round on him. Not a word. Then back to Hamish. I could recommend you for promotion out of this nest. See how you like a desk in Inverness. That struck home more than Blair knew. Hamish's heart gave one queer, sinking movement at the thought of being promoted away from Lochdub, as if reward were the nastiest form of punishment. She came to tell me because she did not trust you, he said. Who would? That, said Hamish softly, is exactly the difficulty. Blair's face went dark. Get her in! Now! By then it was too late for privacy. Priscilla's statement had to be taken with all the village ready to measure each word for romance, shame, or advantage. Worse, others had heard enough of the row on the pier to know that there had indeed been voices. But now, because Blair had started roaring through Lochdub like a badly tuned tractor, no one wanted the bother of speaking up. A crofter's wife who had seen a figure near the sheds suddenly remembered nothing certain. A lad from the harbour said he might have heard raised voices but would rather not be named. Mrs. Wellington, who had first thought she could place the time of Cleo's return, now said she could not be sure whether it had been Thursday, Friday, or a year of grace. Fear of Blair worked faster than police procedure. By late afternoon, Hamish had taken Priscilla's formal statement, endured Blair's commentary on every sentence, and gained very little beyond what she had first told him in private. The one useful thing was this. The argument on the pier had happened later than he had thought. Late enough for the harbour to be mostly empty. Late enough for a planned meeting, not a chance encounter. When Blair had finally stamped off to the hotel to drink and telephone his superiors, Hamish stood for a while in the quiet station and felt the full weight of his own mistake. He had meant kindness. He had got gossip, injury, and delay. Elspeth had not come back. Outside, evening was drawing over the loch again. A light rain had started, fine as dust. Lugs lay down by the stove with a groan of old bones and disappointment. Sonsie reappeared under the chair, her wild eyes bright in the dimness. Hamish looked down at them both. "In Lochdub," he said aloud, "a man can ruin a day just by trying to spare somebody one." And with the village now buzzing in the wrong direction, and Blair louder than ever, he began to wonder who had benefited most from all this noise, while the truth kept sensibly out of sight. Chapter 7. The knot on the wrong rope. The weather turned finer, only to become more unpleasant. The rain stopped, but the wind came in off the loch with a thin, needling force that found every gap in coat and collar. The harbour looked scrubbed and exposed. Ropes knocked against wet posts. Nets hung from hooks like dark washing. Far out, the line between water and sky kept losing its patience and blurring again. Hamish came down early, with lugs beside him, and his hands deep in his pockets. After the muddle over Priscilla's statement, he wanted something that would not change because people were embarrassed, frightened, or vain. Rope, he thought, was often better company than witnesses. Lugs paused near the first bollard, sniffed with solemn care, then folded himself down on the boards as if the investigation might as well begin there. He looked once more like an old hearth rug that had been dragged outdoors by mistake. The harbour was not yet busy. Archie McLean was working by the sheds with a knife and a short length of line. Eyelid Gunn was coming out of the co-op office carrying a ledger and a tin mug. Her dark hair was pinned back as neatly as ever. She looked tired, but in an efficient way, as if even fatigue had been put in order before breakfast. "You're early," she said. "So are you." "I always am." "Aye," said Hamish. "I'd noticed." She glanced at the dog. "And him." "Lugs keeps irregular hours. That's one way of putting it." Hamish gave a faint smile and walked towards the slipway. The mooring post still stood where it had on the morning Cleo was found, though the loose rope had now been gathered and hung ready for examination. He bent over it again, patient this time, feeling along the fibres, studying where the strain had bitten. Behind him, Eyelid said briskly, "If you want the hire records, I've them in the office. I brought them out last night, in case Blair demanded them again." That was thoughtful. "I prefer not to have him crashing about among the papers. So do most things that can think." That won him the ghost of an unwilling smile. She came a little nearer. "The dinghy was hired in Cleo Marr's name, for one evening only, paid cash. No irregularity there." Hamish did not answer at once. He was looking at the rope just above the frayed section. Something small had caught his eye. A short piece of orange creel twine had been used there as a makeshift tie, as if to neaten the loose part of the line or hold a turn in place until it could be redone properly. Only, it had not been redone properly at all. He touched it lightly. There it was again. 3 compact turns, tar stiff at the finish. A stopper knot, neat as a signature. Hamish straightened slowly. "That's odd," he said. Eyelid looked down. "What is?" "This," she frowned. "Only a bit of twine." "Aye, on the wrong rope." Archie, hearing them, came over with his knife, still in one hand. "Let me see." Hamish held the line out. Archie peered at it, then gave a small grunt. "Well now, you tied it?" asked Hamish. Archie looked offended. "No, on a mooring rope. You'd use proper line, unless you wanted a quick hold to behave like a proper one for a little while." Hamish looked at him. "For a little while," Archie shrugged. "Enough to pass a glance. Enough to take a strain and then slip or give when the pull changed. It's no the sort of thing I'd trust on water." Eyelid said, a shade too quickly. "It may have been done in haste by one of the lads." "What lads?" asked Hamish. "The co-op hands. You've no co-op hands working nights?" "No, but—" She stopped. It was only a pause, but Hamish heard it. He crouched down again and examined the twine more closely. It had been tied with practised fingers. Not fancy, not decorative, practical and tidy. The tar on the end was the old co-op way of stopping fray. Archie had shown the same thing the day Cleo arrived, but in a basket tie where it belonged. Here it sat on a mooring rope where it had no business being, unless it had been meant to do a particular job. Hamish stood and looked out across the water. He pictured Cleo at night, stepping down towards the dinghy in mist, thick enough to hide a face. The line would seem secure at first glance. It might even hold while she shifted her weight and settled a foot. Then the boat would pull differently. The little false help would cease helping. The rope would slip free or give too much at once. In dark water and fog, a moment was enough. "A clever sort of carelessness," he said. Archie nodded. "Aye." Eyelid folded her arms against the wind. "You are building quite a theory out of string." "Twine," said Hamish. She gave him a look. "Very well. Twine." But she had lost some colour. Hamish noticed that. He also noticed how quickly she had offered records, times, explanations, and sensible alternatives whenever he asked nothing at all. It was not guilt. Not yet. Plenty of honest people rushed to be useful when a murder touched their work. But Eyelid's usefulness had the feel of something laid out in advance, he said mildly. "How many folk have access to the orange creel twine?" "Anyone in the co-op might, in theory." "In practice?" "In practice," she said. "Mostly me and Archie, and whoever is mending gear under instruction." Archie snorted. "No Ian anyway. He hates the tar. Says it gets sticky on his hands." Hamish remembered that. Down the quay came Nessie and Jessie Curry, walking side by side as if gossip had sent for them formally. "Still at it," said Nessie. "At it," said Jessie. Mrs. Wellington followed a little behind, with a basket and the expression of a woman who disapproved of murder, chiefly because it disturbed the shopping. The information channels of Lochdub, Hamish thought, remained in perfect order. Nessie peered at the rope in Hamish's hand. "Found something?" "A knot," said Hamish. "A knot," echoed Jessie, disappointed that it was not bloodier. Mrs. Wellington said, "I always say there is a right way and a wrong way to do even the smallest thing." "That," said Hamish, "may prove true." He took the rope and the attached piece of orange twine up to the co-op shed, where the wind was less sharp. The inside smelled of salt, tar, and old wood. Hooks, boxes, floats, and spare lines were kept in the kind of order that came from Eyelid's hand rather than any natural tendency of fishermen. She unlocked the supply cupboard without being asked. "You'll want to compare it." Hamish looked in. There were several spools of orange creel twine on the shelf, stacked beside a small tin of tar dressing and a row of labels. Everything sat square. Everything had a place. Too neat, he thought suddenly. Too very neat for a harbour, unless someone had worked hard at preserving appearances. He lifted one spool, then another. One had been handled recently. Another had a rough edge where some length had been taken off in haste. Eyelid said, "You see? It proves nothing." "Not yet. You cannot accuse half the harbour staff because they use the same supplies." "There isna half a harbour staff." Her mouth tightened. Outside, Lugs gave a bored sigh. Inside the shed, where the smell of tar and rope held steady, Hamish found his thoughts settling in the way they often did when facts began at last to prefer him to people. It was not just the orange twine. It was the choice of it. A fisherman like Ian used green line for his own gear and tied in his own way. He worked rough and direct. This little stopper knot was different. It had been made by someone who wanted the line to look ordinary enough not to attract notice, yet controlled enough to behave for a short, dangerous interval. Someone tidy. Someone used to co-op supplies. Someone who would think first of keeping the harbour running, the records straight, the appearance respectable. Hamish put the spool back on the shelf. When he turned, Eyelid Gunn was watching him with a composed face and eyes just a shade too bright. And Hamish, feeling the wind press at the shed door and the case narrow by one careful degree, thought that the rope had begun at last to point not towards the loudest suspect, but towards the one person who understood exactly how to make an accident look efficient. Chapter 8. A neat answer, too neat. By lunchtime the village had grown hungry for an ending. It was not a noble hunger. It had very little to do with justice and a great deal to do with comfort. Lochdub had been living for days in a draught of unease, with strangers' motives, harbour accounts and private feelings all blowing about together. People wanted a door shut somewhere. If that meant shutting it on the wrong man, many would still sleep better. The Red Lion was full in that stiff, over-bright way a place becomes when everyone has come out partly for food and partly to see who dares say what. Damp coats steamed by the fire. Cutlery knocked against plates. The air smelled of broth, ale, and the sharp vinegar of pickled onions. Outside, the weather had turned undecided again. A pale strip of light showed over the loch, but the clouds still hung low, and the wind worried the sign above the door. Hamish sat at a table near the back with a bowl of broth, coarse bread, and more company than he wanted. Blair had installed himself opposite with a plate of steak pie and the expression of a man on the brink of public triumph. Jimmy Anderson sat a little aside, keeping his head down and his opinions lower. Lugs lay beneath Hamish's chair, flat on one side like an old hearth-rug dropped where he had happened to lose interest in moving. Every so often he opened one eye in the direction of the bread-basket. Near the window, Sonsie had appeared from nowhere and taken possession of the sill, where her wild yellow eyes dismissed the room in general and Blair in particular. Nessie and Jessie Curry were at the next table with Mrs. Wellington. Elspeth was farther off by the fire, speaking to no one. Priscilla had not come in, though Hamish knew well enough that her absence would itself be noted, weighed, and interpreted. Blair cut into his pie and said, "Right, let's have it plain." Sutherland quarrelled with the woman. "The boy says she threatened trouble. He's hot-tempered. She ends in the water. We arrest him, lean on him, and I dare say the rest follows." Hamish dipped bread into the broth and said nothing at first. It was good broth, rich with barley and stock, and he found himself absurdly grateful for that. A man could almost think clearly over decent soup. Blair mistook the silence for surrender. "There now," he said. "You see, even you can recognize the obvious when it sits on your plate," Jimmy muttered. "Unlike the canteen stew." Blair ignored him. Hamish looked down into the broth. The theory was tidy. Worse, it was tempting. Iron had motive enough to satisfy a village, and temper enough to satisfy Blair. He had been angry. He had been challenged. He had reason to wish Cleo silent, if she meant to stir up harbour talk and drag names into the open. One shove on a misty quay, and there you were. No contrivance, no deeper rot, no further damage to Priscilla, Elspeth, or the co-op. It would be so easy to let the village have what it wanted. Across the room, Nessie Curry was saying in her carrying voice, "Men like simple answers because they save thought." "Save thought," echoed Jessie. Mrs. Wellington said, "That does not mean they are always wrong." "No," said Nessie. "Only frequently." Hamish almost smiled despite himself. Blair put down his knife with a clack. "Well?" Hamish set aside his spoon. "He had anger," he said slowly. "He had opportunity." He admitted the row. And if the boat shifted while she was stepping in, a push need not even be hard. Blair sat back in satisfaction. "Exactly." Jimmy glanced up sharply at Hamish, but said nothing. The room had gone subtly quieter. Lochdub could sense an official story being born and wanted the first look at it. Hamish went on, though every word felt as if he were trying on a coat cut for another man. Cleo threatened folk. She made herself dangerous. Ian's no patient. It is possible he confronted her at the slipway after the pub. Possible he lost his temper. Possible, he thought, one scare would do, and it turned worse. "There," Blair almost crowed. "That's it. At last." At the fire, Elspeth's face changed. Not much, but enough. She looked not relieved, only tired. Hamish saw in that look what the village answer would mean. Priscilla's part would shrink. Eyelid's name would vanish. The co-op would go on. Ian's family would become the bad sort of family for a year or two, perhaps longer. People would lower their voices when Davy passed. Women would say his mother had suffered nobly. Men would say his father had always been rough. Then they would all carry on, believing that order had been restored. And Blair, of course, would have the loudest part in it. He was already warming to his role. "I'll have him taken this afternoon," Blair said. "Public enough to make the point. We'll see how quickly he stops being stubborn then." Hamish's hand tightened on the spoon. "Public enough?" "Aye. Folk need to see that things are done." "Or that you are," said Hamish. Blair smiled unpleasantly. "Same result." Lugs sighed beneath the table, as if even the dog found this talk exhausting. Hamish tore another piece of bread, but he did not eat it. Something was wrong, and not only morally. The wrongness had been needling at him all morning, like the weather. He let the false theory sit in his mind, and found that it would not settle properly. It rocked. Across the room, Archie McLean came in from the harbour, with the smell of wet rope on him, and nodded to Hamish. He carried a coil of green line under one arm. "Green." Hamish looked at it, and felt the thought come back whole. "Green twine. 2 turns. No tar. Sticky hands." He put down the bread. Blair was still talking. "If he denies it, we've enough to squeeze harder." The son heard her threaten him. "She was found by his part of the quay. It's the cleanest answer we'll get." Cleanest. That was the word that did it. Hamish sat very still. Ian Sutherland was not clean. Nothing about him was clean in the relevant sense. His gear was rough and practical. His boots were caked in ordinary harbour filth. His knots were economical and stubborn. He used green twine on principle. He hated tar because it stuck to his fingers. Even his anger was untidy. But the mooring rope had not been untidy. That little orange stopper knot had been neat. Purposeful. Co-op neat, Hamish heard himself say. "No." Blair stopped. "What?" "No." The word was quiet, but it carried. "What nonsense now?" Hamish looked up at him. "It's too neat." Blair stared. "You just said—" "I said it was possible." "No, that it was true. That is splitting hairs." "No, it's splitting rope." Jimmy closed his eyes briefly, as though in gratitude. Blair leaned forward, his face darkening. "For God's sake, Macbeth!" Hamish spoke more clearly now, the whole thing rearranging itself at last into sense. "Ian uses green twine on his own gear. Always. He ties off with 2 turns. He said so. Archie confirmed it. The knot on the mooring was orange creel twine. 3 turns, tarred. Co-op practice. And Ian hates tar. Says it gets sticky on his hands." Archie, now halfway to the bar, stopped and said, "Aye, he does." Heads turned all over the room. Blair opened and shut his mouth once. "A knot means nothing." "It means somebody made the line behave in a particular way." "Or somebody grabbed what was nearest." Hamish shook his head. "Then it would have been clumsy." "That knot was no clumsy. It was put there to hold for a bit and fail after. No in temper. In plan." Silence followed that. Even Nessie Curry did not at once fill it. Elspeth set down her glass very gently. Mrs. Wellington looked as if she had been obliged to revise a sermon midway through. Blair rallied into bluster. "So you say." "So what? You've still got no murderer." "No," said Hamish. "But I've not got Ian either." Blair pushed back his chair with a scrape that made Lugs open both eyes. "You are determined to make a festival of this." Hamish rose as well, long and loose, and suddenly more certain than he had been all day. "No, sir. I'm determined not to hang the wrong weather on the wrong hill." Blair glared at him in disbelief. "What the devil does that mean?" "It means," said Hamish, "that somebody wanted us to like the simple story too much." He put on his cap and nodded once to Archie. "I'm going back to the harbour." "To do what?" Hamish paused at the door. The wind pressed rain against the panes again, and the loch beyond had gone pale and secretive. "To see who keeps things tidy when they ought to be frightened." And as he stepped out into the cold light, with Lugs heaving himself up to follow and Sonsie dropping soundlessly from the sill to vanish by some private route of her own. Hamish knew the easy answer had failed him. The question now was not whether Ian Sutherland had killed Cleo Marr. It was who had counted on everyone believing that he had. Chapter 9. Sonsie Goes Fishing. By evening, the village had begun to look ordinary again, which in Lochdub was often the surest sign that something dishonest was trying to settle in comfortably. A thin rain had started at dusk and then stopped without conviction. The road shone black under the lamps. The harbour smell came up the slope with the damp, salt and rope and old fish mixed with peat smoke from the cottages. Beyond it all, the loch lay dark and patient, taking no part in village opinion. Hamish had spent the late afternoon writing notes he did not trust and listening to Blair on the telephone, making the case sound simpler than it was. By the time Blair had finished bullying Strathbane and congratulating himself in advance, Hamish felt rubbed thin. He went home to his cottage with Lugs at his heels and shut the door on the lot of them. The little place was cold, but not inhospitable. He lit the stove, hung his cap on its peg, and stood a moment with his long hands spread to the warmth. Lugs had already thrown himself down on the hearthstone, sprawling like an old hearth-rug with every expectation that supper would shortly improve the evening. Sonsie was nowhere to be seen, which generally meant she was either hunting or judging. Hamish cut bread, sliced cheese, and heated what remained of the chowder Mr. Patel had helped improve. It was not grand, but it was hot and honest. He preferred that to Tommel Castle fuss, though he was not too proud to benefit from the hotel kitchens when chance allowed. He poured himself tea instead of whiskey and sat down at the small table with the bowl steaming before him. The quiet helped, but not enough. Eyelid Gunn had not left his thoughts alone all afternoon. The orange twine, the tar, the neatness, the way she was always ready with records, keys, and efficient explanations, none of it amounted to proof, and Hamish knew better than to let a theory harden before it could bear its own weight. He had been nearly seduced into Blair's tidy answer earlier. He would not make the same mistake in a quieter voice. Still, he could not shake the sense that the harbour itself had begun to choose its sides. He ate slowly. Lugs received 2 spoonfuls by way of reward for faithful loafing. The dog took them with grave appreciation and then sighed as if life had offered him less than he deserved. "Ye'd no last a day in Strathbane," Hamish told him. Lugs thumped his tail once in dismissal. When the meal was done, Hamish was washing the bowl at the sink when the cat flap struck sharply. Sonsie came in out of the wet like a piece of the night itself. Her striped coat was dark with drizzle, her broad head was held low. In her mouth she carried something small and cylindrical. She crossed the floor without ceremony, dropped the object at Hamish's feet, and sat back on her haunches, staring at it with fierce yellow eyes, as if she had brought down dangerous game and expected the matter to be taken seriously. "What have ye got now?" said Hamish. Lugs hauled himself up with a groan and came over to inspect. He put his nose to the thing and sneezed violently, then stepped back in, offended surprise. Hamish bent and picked it up. It was the cardboard core from a small spool of twine, chewed at one end and damp with rain. A few last turns of orange creel twine still clung to it. On one side, not quite rubbed away, was a faint printed mark from the Harbour co-op supplier. Near the chewed edge was a dark smear, sticky even now. Tar. Hamish held it to the lamp and felt the hairs on the back of his neck stir. "Well now," he said softly. Sonsie narrowed her eyes. She did not care for praise, but she liked being understood. "Where did ye steal this from?" The cat stood it up at once, turned, and went back to the flap. Then she paused and looked over one shoulder in a manner that would have been theatrical in a human and was merely practical in her. Hamish laughed despite himself. "All right." He took his coat from the peg. Lugs, hearing that tone, began to wag hopefully. Investigation at night usually improved his chances of further food. Hamish tucked the spool core into his pocket, lit a torch, and followed the cat out into the damp dark. The lane behind the cottages was slick with mud. Rain dripped from the hedges. The lamps of Lochdub made soft yellow pools on the road, with black gaps between. Sonsie moved ahead in quick, silent starts. Not hurrying, but not wasting time either. She cut down the side path towards the harbour, as if she had no doubt he would keep up. "Bossy creature," Hamish muttered. Lugs splashed after them, less graceful and more audible. Once he paused to sniff a wall with great seriousness, but Hamish called him on and he lumbered forward again. At the harbour, the nets hung in the dark like damp curtains. A boat knocked hollowly against wood. Somewhere, out on the loch, a bird cried once and then thought better of it. The mist had come in again. Not thick enough to blind, but enough to soften edges and shorten distances. Sonsie slipped under a gap beside the first shed and vanished. Hamish shone the torch low. There, caught on a splinter near the post, was the tiniest strand of orange twine. He moved on. Another snag appeared at the corner of the shed door. Then another near a crate by the loading path. Not much. Nothing a man would see in daylight unless he was looking for it, and perhaps not even then. A spool core dropped or discarded in haste, rolling, nudged, or carried off by a cat. A few scraps where the last turns had frayed loose. The trail led not towards Ian Sutherland's berth, nor towards the public side of the pier. It led towards the co-op shed. Hamish stopped beneath the overhang and listened. There was no one about. The village, so eager by day, had retreated indoors to kettles, radios, and opinions. The harbour belonged again to rope, water, and those who had business with both. He knelt by the shed step and ran the torch along the boards. In one crack was lodged another orange fibre, pressed flat by a boot. Near it, faint but visible in the sidelight, was a smear of tar like a thumb mark wiped carelessly in mist. Hamish stood up slowly. Lugs came and put his nose to the bottom of the door, then sneezed again and backed away, affronted by industry. Sonsie reappeared on a pile of creels, her striped body still and her wild eyes fixed on the shed, as if she had already reached her conclusion and saw no reason humans should lag so far behind. Hamish took the spool core from his pocket and weighed it in his hand. Official supply. Tar. Orange twine. The co-op mark. It was not proof enough to lay before Blair. Not yet. But it was more than suspicion. It was movement. It meant that somewhere between the staged rope and the dead woman, someone had handled co-op supplies in exactly the wrong place and then failed to account for the smallest, most ordinary remains. A village could lie for pride. A witness could lie for fear. A superior officer could lie for convenience. But rubbish had a stubborn honesty all its own. Hamish looked at the locked co-op shed door and thought of Aelid Gunn, tidy and brisk and too ready to help. If Sonsie had brought him a piece of the truth, then the rest of it might still be waiting very close by. And standing there in the wet harbour dark, with the dog sneezing at tar and the wildcat watching like a striped little demon of judgment, Hamish decided that before Blair could force the case back into its easy shape, he would have to open that shed in his own way and find out what else the harbour had been trying not to throw away. Chapter 10. The Mist Test. Hamish went down to the harbour before breakfast, which was a thing he disliked on principle and tolerated only for murder. The morning had come in with fog again, thick enough to shorten the world to a few yards of wet board, black water, and pale air. The harbour lamps were still burning, each one a blurred yellow patch with no shape to it. The loch beyond could not be seen at all. Water lapped against the slipway in a soft, regular sound. Somewhere, out in the whiteness, a gull cried and then went quiet, as if it had thought better of being heard. Lugs followed him unwillingly, broad paws damp on the stones, his blue eyes full of reproach. At this hour he believed strongly in breakfast, and only weakly in justice. Sonsie had come part of the way, then stopped on a wall above the quay, striped and watchful, her fierce yellow eyes narrowed against the wet air. Archie MacLean was already there, small and bent in his boiled shrunken clothes, holding a coil of rope and muttering to himself in a toothless growl. "I'm too old for this sort of nonsense," he said, by way of greeting. "Aye," said Hamish. "But you're still better at it than younger men," Archie grunted, which was as close to pleasure as he usually came before noon. They had fetched an old dinghy of roughly the same size as the one Cleo had hired. Archie had supplied rope, a spare postline, and a sour opinion of modern knots. Hamish had brought a sack of wet sand to stand in for Cleo's weight when stepping aboard. It was not scientific in the Strathbane sense, but Hamish had never yet found a policeman made wiser by saying scientific too often. Mr. Patel appeared from the road carrying a paper bag and a flask. "I thought," he said, "that if you are determined to be foolish before breakfast, you should at least not do it hungry." Hamish accepted the bag with gratitude. Inside were hot rolls with bacon. "You are a blessing." "I am practical," said Mr. Patel. "Also, the dog is staring at me as if I had murdered his family." Lugs, hearing the rustle, brightened at once and forgave the hour. Archie took a roll and bit into it gloomily. Hamish poured tea from the flask into the lid cup and drank while looking at the mooring post through the fog. He had set the test up in his head a dozen times during the night. Now he wanted to see what the rope would do when made to behave badly on purpose. Archie took the orange creel twine from his pocket and held it up. 3 turns. "Aye. With tar?" "Aye," Archie sniffed. "Dirty trick." He made the stopper knot in the same compact way Hamish had seen before, not on the main mooring as a proper hold, but as a makeshift restraint just above the point where strain would bite if the dinghy shifted at the wrong angle. It looked harmless enough. That was part of its value. Hamish crouched by the slipway and checked the line himself. The knot sat neat and ordinary to a casual eye, especially in poor light. The boat rode close enough to step into. A woman in a hurry, or one trusting the arrangement, would think nothing of it. "Right," said Hamish. "Let it take a wee strain first." Archie eased the dinghy against the slip. Hamish lifted the sack and set it near the gunwale, testing the balance. The boat dipped and steadied. "So far," said Archie, "it would pass." "That's what I'm afraid of." He shifted the sack farther in, imitating the moment of a person stepping down and turning to sit. The dinghy rocked away from the stone. The line held. Then it tightened, slid a fraction, caught again, and with the next pull gave more sharply than before. The boat moved out. "Not fast. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough for a foot placed on whetstone to find nothing where there had been something half a second earlier. Enough for surprise." Hamish reset it and tried again. The second time the line held longer. The third time it slipped sooner. But each time the same ugly principle remained. The false neatness allowed the boat to look secure briefly, and then behave as if badly moored, with no clean cut to show deliberate interference. Archie spat into the water. "There ye are. Not snapped, not accidental either. It's meant to fail, handsome." Hamish stood with the rope in his hands and looked at the wet post, the angle of pull, the black water below. In the dark, in fog, with drink perhaps, and anger perhaps, and a man close by saying something sharp. The difference between safe footing and panic would be no more than a blink. Lugs, unimpressed by engineering, had lain down beside the paper bag and was guarding the remaining roll with the gravity of a sentry. On the wall, Sonsie had not moved at all. From the road came the quick steps of the Curry sisters. "Testing it!" cried Nessie. "Testing it," echoed Jessie. "In the fog! In the fog!" Mrs. Wellington was with them, buttoned to the throat and carrying moral concern in a shopping basket. "This seems dangerous," she said. "That," said Hamish, "is rather the point." The sisters came nearer, peering with delighted alarm. So she could have thought the boat steady. Steady, and then down she would go. Down. Mrs. Wellington drew herself up. "That is a wicked thing to arrange." "Aye," said Hamish, still looking at the rope. "And a patient one." Blair arrived at exactly the wrong moment, which for Blair was usually the chosen one. His car came too fast down the lane and braked with a skidding protest. He climbed out red-faced, breathing whiskey through old cigarette smoke, his coat half-buttoned and his temper fully prepared. "What circus is this now?" Hamish did not turn at once. "Morning, sir." "Don't you morning, sir, me. I'm told you're playing with boats instead of taking statements." "I'm seeing how the rope works." "It's a rope. It ties boats." "Sometimes," said Archie. "It unties them." Blair glared at him, then pushed past to the slipway. "Show me." Hamish did. He set the line again, placed the sack in the dinghy, and shifted the weight. The boat held for a moment, and then slid out enough to open a gap between stone and hull. Blair's eyes sharpened despite himself. "Well, it proves the mooring could be made to slip free without cutting the rope," said Hamish. "Hold just long enough for somebody to trust it. Then go." Blair looked round at the little audience and remembered himself. "Yes, yes," he said loudly. Exactly what I've been saying. Jimmy Anderson, who had just come puffing down from the road with a notebook and a hangover, murmured, "Have you now?" Blair ignored him. Hamish's face remained mild. "I didna hear you say it." "I was about to." "Ah, yeah." Blair pointed at the rope. "This gives us attempted staging." "Very good. I'll report that I directed a reconstruction." Hamish looked at him. His voice, when he answered, turned soft and sibilant at the edges. "You may report what you like, sir, but it still leaves you needing the right hands at the rope." For once, Blair did not roar back at once. He was thinking, or near enough to it to be dangerous. "Co-op twine," he said. "Co-op supplies." "Aye, plenty of people could get at that. Some easier than others." Blair's piggy eyes narrowed. "You've somebody in mind?" Hamish said nothing. That was answer enough. The chief inspector drew himself up, suddenly eager again. "Then bring them in." "No." "No?" "No. Not yet." Blair went crimson. "Macbeth, if you think I'm letting you sit on a murderer because you enjoy the drama—" "It's no drama," said Hamish quietly. "It's timing." The word settled in the fog between them. Hamish looked back at the dinghy, now rocking gently against the altered line. The harbour had given him what he needed. The knot could do exactly what he had feared. That meant Cleo's death was not a shove in sudden temper. It was arranged, and arranged by someone who counted on the village loving the simple explanation. A public arrest now would only drive the truth deeper. He untied the rope and handed it to Archie. Then he took the last bacon roll from the paper bag, broke off a piece for lugs, and stood for a moment in the wet morning, thinking of linen, witnesses, and a room in which good manners would hold people in place long enough for lies to show. Tommel Castle Hotel would do very well. When he looked up, the fog had thinned by 1 degree only, but it was enough to show the outline of the harbour lamps. Hamish tucked the thought away. He had proved how the murder was done. Now he needed the right place to prove who had done it. Chapter 11. The seafood tasting at Tommel Castle. Tommel Castle Hotel glowed against the wet evening like an argument in favour of money. Its windows shone warmly above the loch, and the gravel sweep before the entrance had been raked into a degree of order no Highland weather could ever quite respect. Inside, the seafood tasting had drawn tourists in careful clothes, a few local worthies, and several villagers who would later speak of the event as if they had attended on public duty. Linen, candlelight, polished glasses, and silver dishes gave the place the air of trying not to notice the rain. Hamish had chosen it for that reason. At the harbour a man could walk away. In the pub he could shout. In the hotel dining room, under candles and the disapproving eye of the management, people were forced into better manners than truth usually enjoyed. He arrived with lugs, who was immediately barred from the dining room with regretful firmness, and left in the care of a sympathetic porter and the promise of kitchen scraps. Sonsie had not been invited, and would not, Hamish thought, have accepted. The manager met Hamish with the kind of smile hotel men reserve for policemen, who might be useful but ought not to linger. "Everything is prepared, Constable Macbeth." "Aye. Thank you. The minister is in the lounge. Mr. Halberton Smythe sent his daughter down a few moments ago. Mr. Sutherland is here. Miss Gunn arrived on time." "Of course she did," said Hamish. The manager hesitated. "And Chief Inspector Blair?" Hamish looked past him towards the door. "No one asked him not to come." That proved enough of an answer. The lounge beyond the dining room had been arranged for tastings and conversation. Small tables held platters of smoked salmon, prawns, oatcakes, little bowls of chowder too delicate for Hamish's taste, and glasses of white wine. The minister stood by the fire in a dark suit, looking as if he would have preferred a funeral, where things were plainer. Mrs. Wellington was not present, which Hamish suspected was mercy on all concerned. Priscilla stood near the window, pale and composed in a dark green dress, one hand resting on the back of a chair. She did not look in the least like a woman included for protection, which was exactly why Hamish had asked her to come. Better to have her present, named and acknowledged, than kept outside as material for whispers. Ian Sutherland looked uncomfortable in a borrowed jacket and clean shirt, as if decency had been forced upon him by his wife. He nodded once to Hamish, wary but grateful. Eyelid Gunn stood near the far table with a glass in her hand, her expression collected and brisk as ever. She had dressed carefully but not showily. Respectability clung to her like starch. Hamish took it all in and then accepted a plate he did not want, because a man seemed less threatening in a room like this if he held food. He spoke first to the minister. "I'm obliged to you for coming." The minister gave a slight smile. "You said it was wise to have somebody present who could not easily be accused of enjoying scandal." That narrowed the field. From across the room, Priscilla heard that and almost smiled. Hamish moved next to Ian. "You'll keep your temper?" Ian looked offended. "I've brought it in a leash." "That'll do." Then Eyelid came to him of her own accord. "This is a peculiar choice of venue," she said. "Ah, yeah, for discussing a murder. It keeps folk civil." Her eyes rested on him a moment too long. "Does it?" "We're about to see." Before he could add more, a commotion sounded in the hall. A porter's anxious murmur, a heavier tread. Then Blair appeared in the doorway. Pink, damp, and smelling faintly of whiskey under the hotel soap he had plainly applied in haste. He had put on a dark suit that did not improve him. "There you are," he said loudly. "Playing host now, are you?" Several tourists turned at once. The manager closed his eyes briefly in private despair. Hamish said, "Good evening, sir." Blair glanced round the room and saw at once what Hamish had done. Gathered witnesses, suspects, and village respectability into one place where noise would count against the wrong man. He did not like it. "What's she doing here?" he demanded, looking at Priscilla. "Standing," said Priscilla coolly. Blair ignored her. "If you think I won't haul her over the coals because you've put her in a silk dress, you're mistaken." The room chilled by 1 degree. Hamish turned his head very slightly. When he spoke, his Highland lilt softened, and the edges of his voice went sibilant enough to stop a knife in mid-air. "You will not humiliate Miss Halberton Smythe in this room." Blair stared at him. The minister looked down at his glass. Ian straightened. Even the manager, who had meant to intervene on behalf of the furniture, now held back. Blair recovered himself by bluster. "Oh, very fine. Very gallant. Shall we get to the point, then?" "Aye," said Hamish. "That would be refreshing." He set down his plate untouched and took from his pocket 2 things wrapped in a folded handkerchief. He laid them on the nearest table between the bowls of shellfish and the candle-stand. The first was the chewed cardboard core of the orange twine spool Sonsie had brought him. The second was the short segment from the mooring rope, with its orange stopper knot still tied in place. No one spoke. Hamish looked from Ian to Eyelid, and then round the room, making sure the witnesses were all in it with him. "This," he said, touching the rope segment, "is how Cleo Ma died. No by a shove in temper, no by accident either. The dinghy was rigged to look safe for a moment and fail after. I proved that this morning." Blair opened his mouth. Hamish went on before he could speak. "The twine is orange creel twine, tarred at the end, tied in a 3-turn stopper knot. Archie McLean showed the same method at the harbour the day Cleo arrived. It is old co-op practice, useful in the right place. On a mooring rope, it is wrong unless someone wants the line to hold briefly and then slip without leaving the plain mark of a cut." The minister frowned. "So, the arrangement was deliberate?" "Ah, yeah," Ian said, rough-voiced. "And I didna do it." "No," said Hamish. "You did not," Blair barked. "On what basis?" "On the basis that he uses green twine for his own gear, always ties 2-turn knots, and hates tar on his hands. He told us that himself. Before he knew it mattered, Archie confirmed it. The rope work at the Slipway was his habit." Blair shifted, annoyed by facts that had not consulted him. Hamish touched the spool core. "And this came from official co-op supply. It bears the supplier's mark. Sonsie fetched it in from beside the co-op shed. There were fibres and tar traces along the path. Whoever handled the twine handled it there." At that, Eyelid set down her glass very carefully. "You are building a lot from scraps," she said. Hamish turned to her. "Aye. But small scraps are what honest habits leave behind." The words hung there a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Cleo Ma met you first that night because you mattered more than Ian did. You kept the co-op books. You knew what boats went where, what shellfish came in, what went out, and what was written down. Eyelid's face remained composed, but the colour had left it now. "She threatened everyone," she said. "That proves nothing." "No," said Hamish. "Only that she had found something worth threatening over." Priscilla spoke then for the first time in several minutes. "She mentioned money," she said. "And a morning deadline." Hamish nodded. "Aye. By morning, it wouldn't matter what you preferred." The minister looked from one to the other. "Then she was blackmailing someone," Hamish said. "She discovered that shellfish had been going off books. Quiet runs. Quiet sales. Enough to keep the co-op afloat when it should have been failing. Enough, too, to pay for your father's care." The last words were to Eyelid. For the first time she flinched. The manager spoke under his breath. "Good God!" Blair smelled blood now and tried to seize the lead. "There. Financial motive. I'll take it from here." Hamish did not even look at him. "You didna mean to kill her at first," he said to Eyelid. "You thought you could frighten her. Or pay her once and hope she'd go." But Cleomar was no built to stop. She wanted money and a story besides. A public romance, perhaps. Some foolish angle to sell later. She laughed at you. She said she'd put it all out by morning. So you arranged the dinghy. No cut rope. No struggle. Just a little neat failure in the mist. Eyelid's hand tightened on the stem of her glass. "I kept that co-op alive," she said. No one moved. "My father's in Inverness. Do you know what they charge for proper care? Do you know what happens when catches fail and fuel rises and the accounts no longer add up? Men lose boats. Families go under. I kept them working. With illegal shellfish runs," said Hamish. "With survival," she snapped, and then heard herself. The room grew stiller than before. Even Blair knew enough to say nothing yet. Eyelid looked at the rope segment on the table, and then at the spool core. When she spoke again, her voice was lower. She was laughing, she said. That was the worst of it. Not the threat, the laugh. As if all of it were cheap. "My father! The co-op! The village! Cheap!" Priscilla closed her eyes briefly. Hamish said, not unkindly, "So you let the harbour do the rest?" Eyelid gave one short, broken breath. "It might have been a laugh turned wrong. I only meant the boat to drift, to scare her. But when she slipped, she stopped and swallowed. I heard the splash. I heard her calling once. I stood there. And did nothing. That was enough." Blair surged forward at last, puffed up with recovered authority. "Eyelid gun, I am arresting you." But the room had already heard the truth in its proper shape, not his. Hamish stood back as the manager sent for a porter, and the minister quietly moved nearer Priscilla, not from suspicion now, but from courtesy. Ian stared at Eyelid with a mixture of anger and pity. Priscilla met Hamish's eyes across the candlelight and gave the slightest nod. The harbour had spoken through a knot, a spool core, and one woman's habit of keeping things too neat. And as Blair began loudly claiming the case in front of witnesses who knew better, Hamish had the weary feeling that solving a murder was one thing, living afterward with the village was quite another. Chapter 12. Blair's Trophy and Hamish's Apology. By morning, Lochdub had the look of a village pretending it had not enjoyed itself. Rain had passed in the night, leaving the roads dark and shining and the air washed clean in that cold Highland way that made every stone look honest, whether it was or not. The loch lay pewter grey under a ragged sky. Smoke rose from chimneys. Doors opened and shut. Women went to the shop with baskets, and men to the harbour with their collars up, all wearing the expression of people who had happened to hear the news rather than helped produce it. Hamish knew better. He had scarcely opened the police station when the first version arrived by way of Nessie and Jessie Curry. She confessed in public, at Tommel Castle, among the smoked salmon. Smoked salmon. And Chief Inspector Blair took charge. Hamish, who had not yet had enough tea to forgive anyone, looked at them over the rim of his mug. That'll be his version. Nessie gave him a sharp smile. It is already several versions. Several. Lugs lay by the stove, sprawled like an old hearth rug, with one ear turned vaguely towards the door. He had eaten a very decent breakfast, and therefore considered human affairs possible but unnecessary. Sonsie sat on the sill. damp at the whiskers from some private expedition. Her fierce yellow eyes fixed on the lane as if she mistrusted the entire village and saw no reason to keep it to herself. Mrs. Wellington appeared behind the Curry sisters with a parcel under one arm. "I only came to say," she said, "that we were all too quick." "That," said Hamish, "is civil of you." She drew herself up. "It is also true," Nessie said at once. "Not all of us." "All of us," said Jessie, betraying her. Mrs. Wellington went faintly pink. "Well, many of us." That was as much public repentance as Lochdub generally managed before luncheon. By 10 o'clock, Blair had improved the matter further by arriving in full voice. He came in without knocking, pink-faced and triumphant, smelling of cigarettes despite hotel soap and carrying a folder as if it contained military glory. "There you are, Macbeth," he said. "Thought you'd be asleep after all your dramatic arrangements." Hamish did not rise. "Morning, sir." Blair planted himself before the desk. "I've spoken to Strathbane, I've spoken to Inverness, and I've spoken to the press office. We'll keep the business tidy. Embezzlement, illegal shellfish sales, blackmail, resulting death. Chief Inspector Blair supervising the investigation. Very solid." Hamish stirred his tea. "That sounds comfortable." "It sounds official." Blair leaned closer. "And as for you, there may be something in this after all. You handled yourself rather well in the end. Might be time you were moved on. Inverness could use a man who can think when pushed." Hamish looked up then. He had always dreaded praise from Blair more than abuse. Abuse passed like weather. Praise came with paperwork. "I'm well enough where I am." Blair laughed. "Don't be absurd. A man can't stagnate in a village forever. That depends on the village. You'd do better with prospects." Hamish's face stayed mild. "I've prospects. A kettle, a dog, and a roof that mostly keeps the rain out." Blair snorted. "You Highland fools grow sentimental over puddles." He tapped the folder. "Still, it may do you good. I'll mention your name." "Please don't." Blair, hearing that as modesty instead of horror, grew more pleased with himself. "We'll see," he said. "In any case, I'll be taking the final credit lines today. There's to be no village nonsense about cats solving murders." He went out as noisily as he had come. Hamish sat very still for a moment after the door shut. Lugs opened one eye. Sonsie twitched her tail and looked away in contempt. "Exactly," Hamish told them. Outside, the village was already carrying Blair's version from door to door. It would not do. Not because Hamish wanted credit, but because Lochdub would accept the loudest shape of the story unless someone put the gentler truth in its path. He put on his cap and went first to Patel's general store. The queue was in full leaf. Mrs. Patel was slicing bacon at the counter. Mr. Patel was restacking tins that had no need of it. Nessie and Jessie had somehow got there before him, despite having just left the station. Archie McLean stood near the door with a paper parcel. Mrs. Wellington had evidently decided that one visit was not enough. Elspeth was by the shelves, choosing tea with an attention that made plain she did not want to be approached easily. Priscilla, to Hamish's surprise, was also there, cool and composed in a pale coat, as if she had come specifically to force the village to look at her properly in daylight. Good, he thought. Better so. Conversation thinned when he entered. "That's awkward," murmured Mr. Patel with satisfaction. Hamish took his place near the middle of the shop. "Before anybody says anything foolish," he said, "Miss Halberton Smythe was a witness in this case. Nothing more and nothing less. She came forward properly. I delayed her statement, and that was my mistake. No hers. The effect was immediate." Mrs. Wellington said, "Indeed." Nessie Curry looked disappointed. "That's not how it sounded." "That," said Hamish, "is because sound travels badly through shop queues." Jessie nodded before remembering she was meant to support Nessie. Priscilla looked at him once, coolly but not unkindly. "Thank you." Elspeth still did not turn. Hamish went on. "And Ian Sutherland had no hand in Cleo Marr's death, nor did his family. The Harbour can stop treating them as if bad weather were hereditary." Archie grunted approval, Mr. Patel said. "Quite right," Mrs. Patel added, with the authority of the counter. "I said as much." Whether she had or not, no one challenged her. That left one piece still to be mended. Hamish waited until Priscilla had taken her parcel and gone out, carrying with her a trail of relieved curiosity, and until most of the queue had followed some fresher distraction. Then he turned towards Elspeth. She was standing by the tea shelf with a packet in one hand and a face like closed weather. "Would ye walk a bit?" he asked. "I might," she said. "If it's not for official purposes." "I've had enough of those." They went out into the lane together. The wind had freshened off the loch, bringing the smell of wet earth and distant salt. A pale strip of light had broken over the hills at last. Down by the harbour, men were beginning to move with something like ordinary purpose again. Hamish kept his hands in his pockets. "I owe you an apology. A rare opening. I shouldn't have sat on Priscilla's statement. No, I thought I was sparing her, Blair. And in doing so, you made me look like a fool." Hamish glanced at her. Elspeth's voice was steady, but the hurt in it was plain enough. "I know." She walked on a few steps before speaking again. "It was not jealousy, Hamish." "Not only that." He said nothing. "It was the village," she said. "And you. You treat gossip as weather, something to wait out. That's easy for you. For the women it lands on, it sticks longer." That was so fair and so accurate that he could not defend himself against it. "I'm sorry," he said again, more quietly. She studied him a moment, then looked away towards the loch. "I know you meant kindness. That is often your most irritating quality." A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth despite herself. He took heart from that. "I'll try to be irritating in better ways." "You usually are." They had reached the harbour road now. Ian Sutherland was mending a line beside his boat, while Davy carried boxes under Archie's eye. No one spat after them. No one crossed the road. The work was ordinary again, which in Lochdub counted as mercy. Hamish went over. "I wanted to say it plain," he told Ian. "The matter's settled. Blair may roar, but the village has heard enough. If anybody bothers Davy, send them to me." Ian gave one slow nod. "Aye." His wife, Morag, appeared from behind the shed with a basket of food wrapped in cloth. She had the tired face of a woman who had lived for days in other people's judgment. "There's haddock pie at home," she said to her son. "And broth." Davy, hearing that, brightened at once. Hamish smiled faintly. "That sounds better than anything in Strathbane." "Everything sounds better than Strathbane," said Archie. Even Ian almost smiled. When Hamish walked back towards the station, lugs plodding beside him and the wind easing at last over the water, he felt some small part of the village set right again. Not all of it. Lochdub would go on talking. Blair would go on claiming. Priscilla would soon leave, and Elspeth might or might not forgive him fully before she did. Such things could not be mended as neatly as rope, but the worst of the wrong story had been stopped, and as the harbour lights, still unneeded in the pale afternoon, stood waiting for evening in a line above the water, Hamish found himself thinking that one nuisance remained greater than gossip, greater even than murder solved. It was the thought of Blair writing to Inverness on his behalf. Chapter 13. Harbour lights, properly mended. A clear evening came at last, as if Lochdub had decided it had had enough of fog, whispers, and official shouting for 1 week. The rain had gone. The hills stood out clean and green beyond the loch, with the last light lying pale gold along their shoulders. The harbour, which had seemed for days like a place waiting to be accused of something, looked once more like what it was, a working edge of water, wood, and weather, never elegant, often untidy, but honest when left to itself. Hamish stood by the pier with his hands in his pockets and watched the lamps being checked before dusk. Archie McLean was muttering over one of the fittings. Davy Sutherland carried tools without being looked at sideways by every passing neighbour, which counted as progress. Mrs. Wellington had already told 3 separate people that the village ought to show more charity, and had managed to sound as if she herself had invented it. Nessie and Jessie Curry had taken to explaining, at length, that they had always suspected there was more to the business than male temper. They were not believed by anyone with a memory, but this did not discourage them. The harbour co-op had not collapsed, though for a day it had threatened to do so simply from shame and confusion. An inspector from Inverness had come up with forms, disapproval, and the sort of shoes that made lugs suspicious on sight. But the books, once opened properly, had shown enough lawful trade left in them to keep the place going if watched carefully and honestly. Tommel Castle had agreed to buy through the co-op on stricter terms. Archie had declared that if the place failed now, it would be from paperwork rather than fish. Mr. Patel said paperwork had been ruining decent arrangements for years. Hamish thought they were probably both right. Lugs lay on the bench near the harbour wall, as if he owned not only the best seat but the evening as well. He had stretched out full length, one ear folded back, and ignored all traffic unless it seemed edible. Sonsie, by contrast, sat on a pile of creels with her striped tail curled round her feet and her wild yellow eyes fixed on the water. She looked as untamed and disapproving as ever, and Hamish liked her for it. He heard a motor car behind him, and turned. Priscilla had come down to say goodbye. She stood by the road in a pale coat, gloves in one hand, her fair hair stirred by the light wind. The loch and the lowering sun behind her. "Leaving?" he asked. "In 10 minutes," she said. "If I wait longer, the village will arrange a wedding or a funeral. Possibly both." She smiled at that. For a little while they stood in silence, looking out over the harbour. It was not awkward. With them, awkwardness usually required more words. "You were right to bring me to the hotel," she said at last, "whatever the gossip." Hamish shrugged. "It was the only way to stop worse gossip. That is almost a compliment in Lochdub." He glanced at her. "I was glad ye were here." Priscilla looked ahead at the water. "You are often glad in ways that do not travel very far, Hamish. There was no malice in it. That made it worse and better, both at once." "Aye," he said. She turned then and touched his sleeve lightly. Not as Cleo had done, but in the old, restrained way that had always gone straighter to his heart than anything warmer. "Try not to let Blair promote you out of your natural habitat," she said. "I mean not to." "Good." And then she was gone, getting into the little car and driving away with the smooth certainty she brought to everything. Hamish watched until the road took her out of sight behind the rise. He stood there a moment longer than he needed to. "You missed your chance again," said Elspeth behind him. He turned. She had come down from the lane with a notebook under her arm and an expression halfway between amusement and exasperation. "I'm no sure I ever had it." "That has never stopped you from looking tragic over it." Hamish smiled faintly. "Are ye staying long?" "In Lochdub? Long enough to write something accurate before Blair produces a version in which he solved the case with one eyebrow. That'll be difficult to print without laughing." Elspeth came to stand beside him. The wind lifted her hair a little. She looked at the harbour, at Lugs on his bench, at Sonsie on the creels, and then at Hamish. "You do belong here," she said. "That's one way of putting it." "It is the right way." He was about to answer when Jimmy Anderson came hurrying down from the road, out of breath and already apologetic by posture. "Message from Strathbane," he said. "Blair wants you in the morning. Something about papers, and he's written to Inverness." Hamish closed his eyes briefly. Jimmy winced in sympathy. "Thought you'd take it that way." "What papers?" "Recommendation papers, I think." Elspeth let out a small, delighted laugh, which she tried and failed to hide. "That is cruel," said Hamish. "It is funny," she said. "To you, perhaps." Jimmy shuffled. "I might accidentally lose them." Hamish looked at him with sudden hope. Jimmy shook his head. "No, he'd only make me find them." "That's the flaw in honesty," said Hamish. Archie, overhearing from the lamp-post, said, "If they take ye to Inverness, the village will get itself murdered twice a week, just to fetch ye back." Davy laughed. Even Ian Sutherland, working nearby, allowed his mouth to move at one corner. The sun had dropped lower now, and the first harbour light came on properly, steady and calm against the evening. Then another. Then another. No drama. No fuss. Just the small ordered glow of things meant to help people home. Hamish took from his pocket a short piece of orange twine he had kept after the case was done. Tar still stiffened the end. The little three-turn stopper knot sat there, practical and unremarkable, as if it had never betrayed anybody in its life. He turned it once between finger and thumb, then put it back again. Small things, he thought, were often the most stubborn. A habit, a knot, a tone of voice, the shape of a lie when it had been tidied too carefully. People might alter stories, faces, loyalties, and even grief, but they were forever leaving some ordinary little mark behind them. Lugs lifted his head and thumped his tail against the bench, demanding either recognition or supper. Sonsie looked over one shoulder with frank annoyance at the noise. Hamish laughed softly. The harbour had its lights again. The co-op had a chance to mend honestly. Ian's family had their place back. Blair remained a threat to peace, order, and promotion policy. In Lochdub, that qualified as a settled ending. He stood for a last moment in the clean dusk, listening to the small sounds of ropes, water, and village life returning to its usual level of nosiness. Then he turned towards home, with the dog lumbering after him and the wildcat taking some private route of her own through shadow and stone. Behind him, the harbour lights held steady over the darkening loch. And for once, that seemed enough. Cleomar came into Lochdub like a bright spark in dry weather, and for a few days the whole village burned with talk. After she was gone, what remained was quieter and sadder. A co-op, bruised but not broken, a family cleared, and a village forced to admit how quickly it had preferred noise to truth. That little orange twine knot looked like nothing at all, only a practical habit from harbour life. Yet it became the one honest signature in a week full of performance. The rope lied politely. The knot did not know how. Charm can open doors, but so can fear. And when people begin protecting appearances, accounts, and reputations, they often tell themselves they are only buying time. The trouble is that time, once bought that way, grows very expensive indeed. In the end, it is often not the grand deceit that gives a person away, but the tiny, normal habit they never think to change. Still, Lochdub is Lochdub. The lights come on over the harbour, the kettle goes on. The dog finds the warmest place in the room. The cat keeps her own counsel. And whatever foolishness people have managed by daylight, evening asks only for a fire, a chair, and a little mercy. Do you think it is easier to spot a liar by what they say, or by the small, ordinary habits they forget to hide? Thank you for spending this evening with me. Do leave a comment and tell me what you made of the case, and whether you trusted the harbour from the start. There will be another Highland misadventure before long, and I hope you will join me for it here on Highland Mystery. Until then, good night.